بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. All right, so welcome to our guest, Brother Saif, Kazim. Um, so this whole idea of this discussion, these interviews actually came out of our conversation with you and a couple of other brothers. Um, so I had, just for the kids' background, so I set up, conversations with my son and several individuals in fields that he thought were potentials, and then I thought, oh, this is a great idea. Like from the conversations we had with these individuals, Brother Saif was one of them. Like, everyone should be exposed to this, and so then I thought of this whole idea. So thank you for that, and we'll
Of
probably go through
course.
some of the
Thank you for
same
doing
ideas.
this.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Yeah, so the youth who are here are high schoolers or early college, like undergrads, and we've gone through I think 21, 22 of these interviews so far in all sorts of different fields, and that's been, I think, very, very beneficial for all of us, including myself and many other people watch on YouTube and are able to benefit. And it just gives a good perspective on the the path. I think the perception that sometimes kids have, and it's troubling for themselves, is they think everyone else has it all together, and they've had a very clear trajectory through their career until they got to this, point of success. And to see that actually, meandering is more of the norm, and opportunities presenting themselves, and maybe failures along the way, and then you find something eventually that is hopefully a good fit. That's more often the case.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I gave your biography to the participants. If you want to describe, like, maybe either like what you do now, or if you want to kind of give us a sense of the kind of how you got there, the trajectory you took as you were studying.
sure. Bismillah. So I'm a lawyer, but I would say that it's a little less conventional path that I've been on. What I currently do is actually very unconventional. It's sort of a new project that's not really done in other places, in other parts of the country. It's sort of an experimental project. The county government here in Houston is trying to figure out ways to better provide legal services to indigents, to people that can't afford services, particularly in the criminal justice system, but also as it relates to that. And so I'm part of an office that is kind of overseeing like a newer approach to those legal services. So I guess some more background. Law as a field, and I think like a lot of other fields, has become very specialized. So people get into kind of one track and then they like become experts in it and they know that area really well. And so what people realized was that people providing legal services were sort of really good at in their one particular area, but maybe not so good at looking at the holistic picture. And so in the last, I would say 25 years or so, there's been a movement, mainly in the kind of nonprofit world, to look at legal services more holistically. So instead of people just doing, for example, criminal defense, or just doing immigration, or just doing housing, there's a push to integrate all of those disciplines into one model and one approach. That way, when someone comes in into any of those systems, there's a way to address all of their needs or prioritize their needs, especially because a lot of these areas in people's lives affect each other. So that's a long way of describing what I'm doing now. I'm kind of overseeing and training attorneys in the criminal system, but helping them implement this holistic practice, and also just overseeing the quality. So that's what I do now. It's sort of a managerial role. I'm not in the kind of day-to-day of taking cases and doing direct legal work, but I do a lot of background work and kind of systemic thinking and managing. And I've been doing that for about 6 months. Before that, I was a public defender for about 6 years, which is direct advocacy. Essentially, if someone gets arrested and accused of a crime, the state has to provide them with an attorney if they can't afford it. And so I was one of those attorneys. I started that in New York, where I worked at a nonprofit organization called the Bronx Defenders, and that organization was one of the kind of pioneers of the holistic model. And then I came here to Houston, where I worked at the Public Defender's Office here, which is a government agency. For law school, I was at the University of Chicago, and I came there straight from undergrad, where I studied at University of Texas at Austin. So a little bit of a background of what I'm doing now and how I got here.
Yeah. So we did talk last week with Naji Mujahid. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I saw that. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
him.
But
Spoken.
so just coincidentally, you're both back to back. But I think your backgrounds are from what our perspective is very different. He went through kind of he had a criminal background that he talked about, which was kind of his springboard into seeing the need for having lawyers who could help people like he had been. And then he also went through kind of modest schooling, but was able to find opportunities. And he said eventually find like success and happiness, even though he didn't go to, for instance, top-notch schools, whereas you were able to go to a top-notch school. So like I think comparison would be that was one of the questions that one of the participants asked as well. Like it's the perception is, if you go to Harvard or University of Chicago, like a top-notch school, then you'd have like a easy springboard into the corporate world, versus a smaller school. Does that really make a big difference? Is that something that people should aspire to? Do you have a perspective on kind of the quality of schools and experiences that you've had?
Yeah, so I think in the legal field, it does make a difference realistically, for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of the initial, and it makes a difference in the kind of initial hiring stage the most, where a lot of it is kind of reputation based, it's sort of relationship based, and a lot of employers, I think, use the school as kind of a shortcut to figure out like how able a person is, and so there's no doubt that it makes a difference, and so that's, I think, an important thing to aspire to. Now, that being said, like as an attorney, I can tell you that I have worked with some attorneys that went to the modest school and didn't go to the top-notch school that are just absolutely amazing at what they do. And I've seen attorneys that went to the top schools, and you can tell maybe they're smart, but maybe there's something missing. Their skills haven't developed, and your education, at least in the legal sphere, I don't know about other fields, it's very it doesn't prepare you for the day-to-day as much as you might think. A lot of law is learned through almost like an apprenticeship sort of thing. That's how you specialize. That's how you really learn the practice. And the schooling is, I think, a way to think about it is like a certain type of training, obviously, that you want to get from it, and then also open certain doors. But really, the hard work of the practice is what makes or breaks people's careers. And I see people at the top who didn't start out at their best school and did great. So
Can you do you have a sense for like what are some of the qualities that the people have who didn't go to the best schools but were successful, and what were some of those things that were failing from the people who did go to the best schools but were unsuccessful? What are the other critical things besides the school, which is obviously different for the two?
Yeah, I think it may seem trite, but I think it's just like a drive. At least in the field I worked in, it's sort of a thankless field. Like not many people are applauding your work, and you kind of get attacked from all sides sometimes. And so the people who I think succeeded and became very good are the people who were driven, and kind of didn't need that to motivate them. So just people that are kind of fighters and wanted to get better and prioritize getting better. Yeah, I think that's really the most important thing, at least what I've seen in my work. Maybe in other areas of law, maybe it's slightly different, I'm not sure, but to me, that's the most important thing.
Did you go the route of going to a corporation then kind of you get skills and go into public defense, or you went straight into public defense? Public defense, is that the right term? Being a
Yeah.
public defender, yeah.
So I went straight in. A lot of people though go the other route, which is that they go work for a firm and they get some skills there, get some experience there, and then try to transition out of that work. I found that, and they do that not just for public defense, but for any kind of public type work, public interest work, and there are many different kinds. I've found that over time, I guess lately, it seems like that's been harder for people to do that transition for various reasons. I feel like before that was sort of the model, but lately I think a lot of these fields have gotten more competitive, and more people are kind of thinking about going into them from the beginning. And so that transition, I think, can be difficult.
Can you explain that? Why is
Yeah.
it difficult now? Why is it different?
I think so. These are just sort of educated guesses, but one reason I think is because the workload tends to be so high in the corporate world. Again, from a limited vantage point here, that people find it hard to get a foot in the door, because a lot of the ways that people would do that is they would do like pro bono work or volunteer work and kind of get the foot in the door and get a little bit of experience to then leverage that into a shift. And that's become harder because I think the expectations now with like how many hours you bill, which I don't know if people have that concept, but essentially like there are requirements for how many hours you spend doing the work. And in a lot of these big firms in the private world, it can be quite intensive.
Can you explain that system?
Yeah, so basically, you have, you're a company or you're a private individual, but in a lot of these places, it's companies. They have a legal issue. Either they are trying to negotiate a contract, or they got sued, or they want to sue someone. So what they do is they hire a law firm. And the way they pay that law firm is the law firm will give them an hourly rate for their attorneys. And the law firm will do the work, and then they will bill the company based on the hours they spend. And so then, but what the law firm does is assigns that work to individual attorneys. And the way they know that the attorney is doing what they're doing is based on the amount of hours they ultimately bill. So obviously quality and all that matters, but the way they get paid is by the billable hour, the number of billable hours that their attorneys are charging. And so typically for a lot of these big firms, that's kind of your metric. In addition to other things, but your big metric is you have to meet the minimum billable hours. I don't even know what those numbers are, but lately it seems like, speaking to my friends and acquaintances, it's quite high. And so I think for that reason, people sometimes have a harder time making transitions. It also seems like another theory that's out there is that the pay is so different in the private world and the public world. Maybe not for all jobs, but in a certain sphere in the private world, the pay is so much different that once people kind of get into the groove and get accustomed to a certain level of compensation, and then maybe they adjust their lifestyle accordingly, the prospect of then moving out of that, even though they may have initially planned to do that, becomes much less likely. They call it the golden handcuffs. And so that, I think, is another issue. But typically, I think most people that start at firms end up going elsewhere. A lot of them go what's called in-house, which basically means that instead of working for the firm, you'll work for a company as part of their legal department. And usually those jobs are much more work-life balance friendly, and kind of are a middle ground between the really intense work and the other side.
Okay. Some of you know Adil Musabji from the Chicago community. So I think he's that kind of lawyer. He works in-house for a company, and yeah, he's able to maintain that kind of balance. He's another person I was thinking of bringing on as a lawyer. I get to Ahmed. There's something I wanted to ask about what you just said. I lost my train of thought. So Ahmed, you go, and then we'll carry on.
So I've actually kind of wanted to be a lawyer for like a couple years now, and I was thinking about it because Sheikh Uzan brought on a public defender, and like I don't know if there were any people in this like that in our like this in our community, but why did you go the public defender route instead of trying to go private? Because of like pay, and then also like sometimes clients can be a little bit more difficult to work with in like a public sense, because they don't have like they're a little bit more difficult to work with, because sometimes not as straight with you. So what made you like want to go with the public defender route instead of trying to go private?
So I still don't have a perfect answer to that question, but what happened is in law school, you have opportunities for like practical experience, and very often all law students will do some kind of pro bono work or clinical work is what they call it.
Is that
And
term pro bono clear? It's free services, right? Okay.
yeah, sorry, I'm sorry if I use words that aren't clear. I apologize. That's another weakness of being a professional, is you end up taking things for granted like that. You know, law schools have programs set up for students to essentially volunteer and provide legal services to people. And then they have sort of lawyers on staff at the law school. They're called clinical professors. They're essentially practicing lawyers that will help supervise students to practice and get practical experience. The clinic I ended up in almost by chance was, it was called the Juvenile Justice Clinic. It was headed by two kind of veteran lawyers that had been around for a long time and had been doing criminal defense primarily for young people, so people in the juvenile system. And they had kind of seen this like transformation that happened in the country, where the rise of kind of mass incarceration and the kind of explosion in the number of people that are incarcerated, and of course there's the racial components to that, and all of the abuses that the system has. And so I was assigned to that clinic and worked with them a little bit and saw how it worked, and worked with some clients, and it was just hard to think about anything else after working with some of those young men, mostly young men. And that kind of...
Why is that? What do you mean
just
it affected you emotionally? It was fulfilling, or what was it?
both, right? It was emotionally affecting. Working for them was fulfilling, and I think that's kind of what drove me in that direction. I also felt like that space is kind of missing some important perspectives. Sorry, and now I'm getting a little bit theoretical, but I felt like what I saw in the debates around the criminal system were so much entrenched in right and left as like American society understands it. And it just seemed to me that like bringing a different perspective would be valuable for people and for that field, and maybe I could contribute something. And
Could you give an example of that political polarization versus the new perspective?
Yeah, so a lot of the people I worked with were sort of the true believers that felt that that people in poverty are kind of should essentially never be incarcerated, that like prisons should be abolished, that a very kind of almost radical position. And I think people are driven to that because they see a lot of these abuses that take place, and they're kind of driven to maybe a more radical position. And on the other side, you have the kind of red-blooded crime and punishment type of folks. And the way I understood, of course, influenced by at least what I learned about Islam, is that there is a truth in both sides, and there's like a balance that has to be struck. Like you have to acknowledge people's humanities, and of course think about their circumstances, but treating people with humanity also means recognizing that they have choice, and then that there's accountability. And so I don't know, I still ended up fall more or less on the side of thinking that the system has many problems that need to be addressed, and I ended up sort of falling on the side of working on behalf of people that are caught up in the system. But certainly, I think myself and some colleagues I've met over the years have come to like a better understanding and appreciation of what all this means and what all changes need to happen, and that doesn't fall in the classic buckets of left or right, I think, as Americans understand it. I'm sorry if that got a little theoretical, but
in this new managerial position that you have, are you able to affect some of that change?
absolutely. So I don't. So I guess part of the tension with any kind of legal work is that the way the system is designed in the United States is that it's an adversarial system. So the lawyer has a duty of loyalty to their client and has a duty of like zealous advocacy for their client. And that, I think, creates an inherent tension ethically, because you don't know who your client is and what are they advocating for. And so there's always a potential that that's going to create problems for you as an attorney. Now, the legal system is totally fine with that, the American legal system, but I think as human beings and as Muslims, there's always a potential that could be a problem. The work I do now is a little bit removed from that because I don't directly represent clients. I'm working at the systemic level. So I don't have to worry about that possibility anymore, which is nice. But also, I get to use the experience I built and the lessons I've learned to try to help attorneys practice better. And the focus that we have, like I mentioned, was to think more holistically, to figure out the best ways to basically incorporate these alternative legal services, because people that come into the system, they may have a criminal case, but that's not their only problem, and that's probably not even their main problem. And in fact, they may have problems that are kind of the cause of their criminal involvement. And so how do we make it so that attorneys are from the beginning involving social workers or mental health clinicians or housing attorneys or benefits attorneys to help create a more holistic approach to the problem, instead of either you get off scot-free or you go to prison for years and years and years. There's got to be a different way to do it, and the way the US system has done it for a long time, I think, is really problematic. So in that sense, it's been nice to be able to be a little creative and do things differently.
Is this unusual? This like a pioneering effort that you're working for? It's state run. It's part of the state system.
So it's part of the county. It's a county office. So I guess more to get more into the weeds, the way that different governments run their indigent defense system is different. Some places have a public defender office primarily, and that's a government office. Some places will contract with private entities to provide those services. So New York City is like that. They're nonprofits that provide those services. And then some places will essentially farm out these cases to private attorneys. So any private attorney that has a practice, they can just sign up to take cases, and the county will give them cases. So Harris County in Houston for a long time did it that way, where it was just private attorneys. It could be anyone almost, and they could just get the case and run with it. Harris County now has a public defender office, but it's still quite small. So it only takes a small percentage of cases. So the county decided that there were a lot of abuses happening, or a lot of problems with the way that just any old attorney was getting assigned these cases, and some of them were doing a great job and some of them were doing a terrible job. And the way those cases were assigned was problematic, because the judges would choose which attorneys got the cases, and the judges were elected, so the attorneys that donated to their campaigns would magically get the work. And so it was just a really troubling system. So the county, due to political changes, decided that there needs to be something different. So they created this office called the Office of Managed Assigned Counsel. The idea of kind of reforming the way that private attorneys got cases and implementing quality control, supervision, as well as this holistic model. And so I joined this office about 6 months ago. The office is about 2 years old. There's nothing really like it in the country. There's similar things, but nothing quite as extensive. And it's grant funded by the state, so it's sort of experimental. it's unclear if it's even going to be around beyond a few years, but it is both rewarding to be a part of like a new project like this because you're kind of forging the path ahead, but it can also be frustrating at times because it's new, you kind of don't know what you're able to do and what you're not able to do. There's no set template. It's also really hard to tell people what it is I do. People expect like a short answer, and I have to go on this long explanation. So.
Right. I mean, go ahead.
No.
I was gonna,
That's it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
sorry. I was gonna ask, in terms of your previous position, is there ever a case where you are dealing with someone who you can tell is, based on what they say and what the evidence is, that they're not a good person at all, and the stuff they've done is really horrible, and it goes against your ethics and morals, but you still have to defend them? Has there ever been that case? And if so, how would you deal with that? Or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, so you definitely meet a lot of people in that kind of work, and these are people with a lot of folks with tough backgrounds, and there were definitely people that I think have behaved terribly and did terrible things. The role itself is somewhat limited, right? Like, you have a responsibility for a client in a case, and the way the system worked is that in the vast majority of time, you're not a decision maker in any way, and you're not even sort of contesting facts in a way that would make me potentially feel comfortable. A lot of the work is sort of negotiation, investigation, and then kind of conversations with your client about their options. So I'll be honest, I did it for long enough to get good experience, but not so long where I was dealing regularly with folks that I felt that potentially that tension would exist, especially because so many of the cases resolve by settlement, essentially by plea bargains. And so I don't think I ever felt like it got to that point where I would not be comfortable working the case at all. And that was part of my reason for transitioning as well, because I wasn't totally sure how I would handle that situation. And so, yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah. If I could go back to your, like, instead of going through a firm, I think it sounds like many people go that route to pay off debts. So financially they're burdened and they have to work for, kind of sell their souls to the devil for a bit to to pay off debts, and then they can kind of do what they want to do for moral reasons, whatever. How if you go straight into the public sector and the pay is not good, are there ways to pay off debt? Like, I know my brother is a teacher, and so when he did his master's in education, then there's a deal in that particular state where if you if you taught in a public school for a certain number of years, they would forgive your debt. Are those kinds of things, or you were just in a good position where you didn't have debts, or you were able to find other ways to pay them or whatever?
There is a federal program. So if you take federal student loans, then there's a federal program called Public Service Loan Forgiveness. And essentially, it's 10 years of public service with on-time, like kind of reduced payments. So they're income-based payments that over time have gotten more and more reasonable, I would say, in terms of how they're calculated. They're calculated based on your income. And essentially, you just make those income-based payments for a period of 10 years. And if you have that 10 years of public service, then at the end, whatever balance remains, even if it's a ballooned balance because of interest, it's forgiven. When I started, the program was still somewhat newish. I think they started in the late 2000s. And so people were still a little bit unsure if it was actually going to play out and be successful for people. But in the last few years, a lot of people have finished the 10 years and gotten the forgiveness. And in fact, due to COVID, with the loans being paused, that time is still counting towards your service, even though people aren't making payments. So it's actually kind of worked out great for those of us that were in this program. The problem is, of course, that so much of this is like politicized, and depending on who the president is and who's in Congress, the agencies are running these programs either more liberally or more stingily. So that's kind of an uncertainty, but it is a program in law that they have to kind of honor, at least the way things stand. And a lot of people have benefited from that.
Was that part of your plan as you went through law school, or you kind of figured that out afterwards that you could get it forgiven like that?
No. It was in law school. It was clear. And actually, our school has kind of a supplement. So depending on the school you go to, a lot of schools, especially a lot of the top schools, have programs that supplement that. So essentially, they'll say that, under a certain amount of salary, even your income-based payment will cover for you, essentially. So
the school pays your payment to themselves.
To the government. So because
to the
these are
government.
federal loans that you take from the government, and the school says, okay, if you do public service, then if your salary is under X amount, even those payments will pay for you, essentially. That's how my school did it. So the first few years, so the threshold isn't super high. So like after a few years, I went above it, and then I was responsible for the income-based payments. But while I was below that, I didn't have to pay anything because, I was paying, but the school was giving me at the start of the year or at the end of the year, the amount that I would need to pay.
Wow.
And so that's a nice little perk. And some schools are actually even more generous than that. The thing is, like, especially these top schools, they want to be known for their graduates excelling in all fields, including in the public sector. That's kind of like a point of pride for them. So a lot of the fundraising they do from their alumni and stuff is to help fund these programs to empower students to go into those fields. Which is
that clear for you all? What he just talked about? That's a huge. I mean, I think it would be a huge consideration, because oftentimes if you go to a school, especially a private school, a top-notch school, then it's expensive, and in law or medicine or some of these fields, then it's very expensive. And then if you can't pay for it yourself, then you have debts, and then that becomes a huge, like, kind of like, I don't know if those are also called golden handcuffs, but it's kind of another kind of handcuff that you're now kind of you have to make enough money to pay off those debts, otherwise you're stuck with these debts, and that can affect so much other stuff. So then you end up kind of selling yourself to the devil to work at a top paying firm where you're doing morally compromised work, or things like that, or your work-life balance is not good and you're spending so much time working because you have to stay in this firm, make that much money, and pay off the debt. So if you know that this is an option, you can actually go to that top school, rack up the debt with the knowledge that this is a program that you can now do good work and have that debt paid off in a limited amount of time, limited amount of payments. That sounds like a very very good alternative. Did I characterize it correctly, Saif?
I think so. So just to give you a snapshot, the first 3 years of my career, I didn't pay anything because my school was paying it. The next 2 years or so, I paid small payments per month. The last 3 years, I've not paid anything. So, like, practically speaking, I'm now close to 7 years in of the 10, and the loan payments have not been a major source of worry. So that really helps. Obviously, like I said, the pay disparity can be quite big. So if you have other financial obligations, obviously you have to consider that. I mean the disparity between public sector work and private sector work. It can be quite big. So you definitely have to consider that, and consider, what utility that extra money would have for you and for any causes you support. But there are definitely ways out there to make this work, and a lot of people make it work, and they do live dignified lives and don't have to worry too much about finances if they do it right.
Can you, like, in a way that you're comfortable, can you kind of give us a sense of not what you make, but like you feel like you have a family, you have I think one child or a couple of children, and you're able to support them, like all that through the kind of salary you make through the public sector? Is that the case?
Yeah. I have 2 kids. We own a home, 2 cars. Alhamdulillah, we're blessed, but it is definitely possible. My wife took a couple years off when we had kids. She now works part-time remotely, with limited hours per week. So it's not like she's, like a full-time earner or anything. And alhamdulillah, we're blessed to be okay. Of course, like the economy is bad right now, so there's inflation. So I know there's a lot of like financial anxieties out there for people. So I don't want to say that like that's not a real concern for people that are in the public sector. But I think if with the right planning, it can definitely be a realistic option for people.
And is it just, I mean, is the prospective income only for subsistence, or could you have, excess income for donating and for helping, supporting your parents, or like, kind of more taking on more burdens than just kind of surviving with your own family?
I think that's where it gets a little tougher, and it depends on your kind of standard of living and kind of what your own expectations are for how you spend your money, essentially. So I think it's definitely possible. One benefit of public sector work is that some of the benefits tend to be quite good, the kind of ancillary benefits of employment. So for example, there's like a really great like retirement system where I work now, where that's just like it's almost like a pension type system, where that's like one less concern I have, because I know that those very long-term savings are sort of being taken care of. And then so the money I do save, I can think more short and medium term, healthcare, things like that. So there are some benefits of private public sector work that help ease that tension. But no, definitely, I mean, definitely there's a point at which you may have it run into those issues. Like if you want to donate a significant amount of money, it will be much harder than if you worked at the firm, or if you have a lot of relatives or family you need to support, that will potentially be much harder. But of course, it depends on a lot of circumstances.
Right.
Don't want to be too rosy-eyed about it, because it's a real difference, and sometimes a dramatic difference in compensation.
Ahmed?
I actually had two questions. My first one was, would the LSATs be the same for like Columbia or Harvard versus like a second tier law school, or are they like different based on like the like level of intensity?
So I think I guess you may be asking about like the scores, like kind of what you're
No, not the
expecting to.
scores. Like, are the tests harder? Are they like equal tests? Or is it the same test? It's like a different like
In the school
Yeah.
itself, or the bar?
no to like the LSATs, the entrance exam.
Yeah, so the LSAT is standardized. So everyone who's going to law school essentially will want to take that. Will have to take that, and you'll take it, either during your undergrad years or right after undergrad before you're applying. It's the same test across the board, but obviously, in terms of opening the door to the kind of more elite schools, you want to score better. The law field, I don't know if other fields are like this, but the law field is very numbers driven when it comes to admissions, law school admissions. If based on your LSAT score and your GPA, you can basically predict the schools you're going to get into to a fairly high degree of confidence. That's at least how it was when I applied, and I don't think it's changed. So, that unfortunately that's just how it works. It's maybe not the best way, but that's the metric they use. They believe that that's the best predictor for how folks will do in law school. And so, yeah, there's even websites that like you put in your GPA and you put in your LSAT score, and it'll give you like a probability chart of like what's your likelihood at each school, just because it's very predictable based on those numbers.
Saif, we'll have to take a pause. We have Chicago people whose prayer time has just started. So we'll just take a 5-minute break for Maghrib, and then we'll have like
Perfect.
10 minutes left.
I'll do the same.
Okay. Okay, Bismillah. Um, I lost my train of thought. If you have any questions, go ahead and jump in. I'll gather my thoughts as well. Oh, this holistic law. This is one thing I wanted to ask about. So, sometimes when you get into like a generalist kind of field, then it becomes also superficial. Is that a danger in what you're kind of what you're doing, or no? That's not what it means in this case.
It is a danger. So there are some kind of attorneys out there that are consider themselves generalists. And they'll have a firm. A lot of times it's like a solo firm or a small firm, and they try to practice like a bunch of different areas of law. And I think the more things they dip their feet in, sometimes the shallower the expertise is. I'm sure there's some that do it all well, but definitely gets harder. There's a reason why people have specialized. So, and that's a challenge that we're dealing with sort of as we're trying to implement these ideas. And the main way that we're kind of trying to deal with that is to work more in teams and collaborate across disciplines. And so instead of the classical model was that like one person gets one attorney and that attorney is like a solo kind of person, but trying to incorporate more kind of team collaboration where you have folks with different expertises kind of on the same team. That's definitely something we deal with.
I think you talked about like in law school you can do pro bono work, and I think Naji Mujahid also was talking about internships and different opportunities while you're in law school to figure out what you want to do going forward. But what about kind of even figuring out whether or not you want to go to law school? Are there maybe experiences that they can expose themselves to figure that out?
Absolutely. One thing I've noticed from people is that sometimes going to law school becomes like an option when they haven't figured other things out. And I feel like sometimes people don't really know what it's like to be a lawyer when they're thinking about law school. And that's what I would advise people to really think about and try to get some hands-on or like a closer view at what that means if that's something you're looking into. Because you should go to law school to be a lawyer, and being a lawyer has that means something very particular in the way it's practiced. Now there is a lot of variety within law, but a lot of it you can learn by watching or volunteering or interning, and that's what I would advise people to do, because I think sometimes people think that like getting a JD is sort of opens a bunch of doors, and I don't know how true that really is. I think it opens the door to being a lawyer, and I'm not sure if it opens many other doors. But there's sometimes a misconception about that.
What was your thinking? How did you kind of know that this is your path?
So my older sister also went to law school, became a lawyer. So I kind of saw that path that she took, and so I had a little bit of familiarity with the process, with what the work was, how it works, what the options are, and that really helped me make that decision. So of course, like friends, relatives, mentors that are attorneys, of course, are great resources for helping you figure that out.
I don't know to what extent you saw the previous interviews, but one of the themes that we've tried to get at is the difference, like a realistic and maybe even a beneficial difference between girls and women's and men's roles and kind of their trajectory. So maybe like this example of your sister versus sister and you, does that fit into that? Like, could a woman, Muslima, kind of go through your route and still have a very healthy family life and those kinds of things, or is it too intense or too kind of like encompass what do you call it, consuming for someone to have family life and be a practicing lawyer?
Yeah, I actually think the public sector is a great option for Muslim women. I don't know about public defense, maybe not as much, but other public sector work I think is really great because it tends to have a good work-life balance. it's not as intense on that front. And I see it with my colleagues, right? Like I see a lot of the what I guess what people would call a gender disparity, where kind of the top firms, the partners that like rise up in the top firms that have their really crazy, intense workload, tend to be men, and a lot of the people that are excelling in the public sector are women, and I think that that's for a reason, right? Naturally, and especially as Muslims, I think the sisters will reach a point where they'll want to prioritize other things, and public sector work in law, I think, is a great place for that, because it's generally understood that the work-life balance is much better. People take time off, time away. Like I said, the benefits can be good. So like the parental leave and things like that are really good. So the legal field generally, people also make that work. I do think the private big firm life could pose some challenges, just based on what I've seen. But a lot of people go into it, do it for a little period of time, and then transition out, which I think is also an option.
So we were talking about public defense, which I understood. Now you interest public sector work is that more broader, like a broader term?
Yeah,
what would
let
be
me
in that part of the Venn diagram that's not public defense but is public sector work?
Yeah. So actually, that's a great thing that I probably haven't talked about. So by public sector work, I mean, even outside of public defense, there's a lot out there in terms of either in the private nonprofit arena or in the government arena that is not, of course, not commercial or private work, but a lot of it is around just providing legal services to people. Areas that come to mind, for example, are family law, immigration law, civil rights work, environmental law. The one that I will plug, because it's something that I think back as maybe would have been a great thing to get into for a bunch of reasons, is immigration law. So I'm going to give this plug. Yeah, I know you guys are in high school, so like this is early, but just something to think about. I think the immigration law space is ripe for bright young people to come into and make a difference. It's something that can help people in our community a lot, because there are a lot of folks in our community that could use that help. And then it's also an area that hasn't had the kind of legal victories that other areas have. And what I mean is, like, there's like decades or even centuries of kind of legal procedural protections and rights for example, criminal defendants, or even in civil cases like jury trials and things like that. There's like a whole history of that. The immigration space, legally speaking, there's not much has happened, because people have very few rights. It's a really, really troubling arena for how folks are treated. And in the Trump years especially, that became very, very clear. And so there is a lot of space, I think, for people to come in that are bright, that are motivated, that are driven, that can help your own community and also help a lot of folks that are very downtrodden and could really benefit from thoughtful people that are doing that. One thing that you really need, though, is language skills, especially Spanish. Spanish is like the door that will open the door to that whole world if you wanted to go that route. So I just wanted to, I definitely wanted to get that in during the session, because that's something I tell a lot of people going to law school to really think about that. It's a little bit harder because the avenues, the pathways aren't as clear, because it's a little bit harder to make your way. So there's going to be uncertainties if that's what you want to do. And so I see why people don't do that, because it's not as simple to go that route. But for the people that do, I think they have a potential to really make a big difference for people.
When you say that there's not a clear route, what does that mean?
Yeah. So basically, if you wanted to go into the private sector, there's a very well established, from the time you're in law school, there's systems in place to help you find a job and help the job find you. And that's through your school, that's through, job fairs and the normal kind of hiring cycle. And even in the public sector, in a lot of different areas, it's sort of similar. There's like a hiring cycle, there's job fairs, the schools get involved. I think the more the narrower you get in like public sector work, sometimes those pathways aren't as well defined or clear until you may not have like a job fair. You may have to send out resumes to a bunch of different organizations. You may have to apply around. You may have to, not be selective about geography. Maybe you have to open to move somewhere. You kind of have to put yourself out there a little bit and like really sell yourself as in order to land something. But there is stuff out there, and I know people practicing in that space, whether that's helping refugees get asylum, or helping people that are in deportation proceedings, or helping people that came here as children that don't have any status get some kind of status so they can continue living dignified lives here. Helping people that are victims of domestic abuse or other crimes that are eligible for certain immigration benefits. Helping community members set up businesses so that they can get status here. I mean, there's so much there, and there's so many different areas that that's my sales pitch for young folks to think about.
Ahmed, what's your question?
So I've heard this, but I'm not sure if it's entirely true. Do you need, is there something beyond law school if you're trying to be a criminal defense lawyer, like an extra, specialization or something?
So law is I think it's kind of unique in that everyone kind of does the same law school, and then specialization is sort of very informal, and it happens your first, second, third job, really the first job and maybe the second job that you get. The first few years out of law school, I should say, are where you sort of become specialized. It's in some ways, it's still sort of that apprenticeship model. Not really, not formally, but so you really don't need to do anything else after law school. The one exception apparently is tax law. If you want to become a tax lawyer, then a lot of people will go back and get another degree called an LLM in tax law. But besides that one exception, law school will allow you to practice any specialty, subspecialty.
I think earlier on you said that the work is thankless. So is that like public sector work or public defense work? Was that what you were talking about?
I was talking about being a public defender in particular.
And does that mean it's not fulfilling, or it's constantly frustrating, or no? How would you characterize the happiness that you get from the work itself?
So I found it to be fulfilling. By thankless, I mean that you're not going to get that kind of recognition from others necessarily. You tend to be sort of like, by the nature of the work, prosecutors, judges, your kind of colleagues in the legal profession are going to be maybe not treat you with the same kind of respect and dignity that they would other attorneys. So that's kind of what I mean. It's not like a popular among people. But
why is that the case? It's reflected in like Law and Order type shows as well, like the public defender is kind of the scum.
The scum, or the guy who defends the scum.
Why is that the case?
Kind of attorney. I think people naturally. I think it has changed quite a bit. I think as there's been more awareness about some of the problems with the criminal system, I think it has changed. There's actually like concerted efforts to change the narrative a bit. And I think in some circles, it's now flipped to where, being a prosecutor is like the sleazy, scummy thing to do. But in society at large, I think that the old narrative is still around a little bit. And because I think I would blame media, like Law and Order has done a lot of damage period, like that show itself, I think is responsible for some really, really problematic ideas about how things work. And in that, you know, the police and the prosecutors are always the good guys, and the other side are pretty much always the bad guys. And I think that has stuck around in the culture a little bit.
Our time, unfortunately, is up. But thank you very much for your time. And yeah, every one of these interviews has been like a deepening of, I think, our collective experience and wisdom that we can be able to gain. So thank you for contributing to that.
Thank you for doing this, Sheikh, and for having me. And thank you all for listening to me. I'm very happy to answer any questions or be a resource. You know, maybe I can share my email address, or Sheikh, if you can do that,
Sure.
please feel free.
Okay.
Yeah, best of luck, of course. And I hope this was helpful.
Jazakumullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.